Hello and welcome to the 24th episode of my podcast, Historians in Conversation. My name is Michał Green and this podcast is hosted by the University of Lodz in Poland. My guest today is Professor Paulina Kewes, or as the British people know her, Paulina Kewes. She is a historian of early modern literature working at the University of Oxford. In our conversation today, we will be discussing how Paulina, who was interested in history, went to study literature, became a literary scholar, and how she actually combines her interest in history with literary studies. So I welcome Paulina to my podcast, and I hope that you enjoy our conversation. Hello, Paulina, and welcome to my podcast. I'm glad to have you here after our rather long acquaintance on Twitter. I'm glad that you agreed to participate in my podcast and tell us about your passion for history.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here.
I always start my podcast with the very same question about childhood, because I think that childhood is the formative stage in one's life. And I think that your story is quite interesting because, as our listeners will have heard from my introduction, you have lived in Poland and then you moved abroad. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit, where do you come from?
I come from Sopot. I lived there until my 20s. And I come from a family where my father was Russian Jewish and my mother was Polish Catholic. I was a late child for both of them, especially for my father. I was born when he was nearing 60 and my mother was about 40. And I had a half brother who was 18 years older. So there were these weird generation gaps, so that people thought that my father was my grandfather, that my brother was my father. Anyway, what it meant was that it was a very grown-up household. So, and I was always expected to learn everything quickly, to learn to read quickly, which I did before I went to primary school. And my father, who was not just obviously a fluent Russian speaker, because he had been born in Russia before the Second World War, but he was also a fluent French speaker. I don't know his exact story during the Second World War, but I know that he had a paper which stated that he got a degree in French from the University of Tashkent during the Second World War. So, and he tried to teach me both Russian and French. And when I was a little girl, and I was too silly to take him up on this. I was only studying English, which was after hours because it wasn't something that was taught in school. But my father especially read a lot to me. And when I think about the books that he read to me, I wasn't particularly interested in silly children's books. That's something that my mother was trying to, introduce me to. And some things about little jumping frogs and other animals, it just didn't quite appeal. Whereas I loved the tales that my father read to me. For instance, the Russian tales about Ilya Muromets or Tsar Sultan, all kinds of things. And then very quickly on, he started reading, adventure books, but more serious ones. So we read a lot of Robert Louis Stevenson, Kidnapped and Catriona and Treasure Island. In the woods, there was a particular fallen tree, which for me was Captain Flint's fort. That's what it was. And he also read a lot of French books, especially Alexandre Dumas, The Three Musketeers,
The very popular one
Vicomte
in
de
Soviet times.
Bragelonne, and also Count Monte Cristo. And The Three Musketeers and Vicomte and Count Monte Cristo were my favorite books. And my father was such an avid reader that, his two passions in life were reading and playing bridge. So he would come back from work, and his work was not nondescript. He would read and he would go out to play bridge with friends. Whenever we went on holiday, first thing he would do, and going on holiday in those times meant going, not very far, say to Jurata or to the Kashubian lakeland. And the first thing he would do was to identify where the nearest public library was. And he would lug kilograms, of books back to wherever we were staying. And I got into the habit of reading everything he brought. And many of the things that I read age 12 or 14 or 15 were way too advanced for that age. But never mind, I read them and I became passionate, really enamored of historical novels and history books. My first great love was Alexander the Great. It was the trilogy of Karol Bunche's novels, and Alexander, Olympias, Parmenio, and the cover of the one about Alexander had this drawing of Alexander, and I was, he was the love of my life at that time. And when we were going on holiday, my father had to Xerox the title page so that I would take the picture of my beloved with me on holiday to the peninsula of hell. And that's how things developed. So obviously I read voraciously, and I didn't only read history, but this passion for history was there very early on. And I remember, say, watching various TV series. In those days, Polish television was very good. So there were TV series which came from France and from Italy and from somewhere else. And I would watch, say, there was a film about Henry Bourbon, Henry IV, by Heinrich Mann. So I watched the film about Henry IV, and then we had a copy of Mann's book on the bookshelf. So I read that. Or there was that famous English TV series based on I, Claudius, and with Derek Jacobi as Claudius. And of course, I read Robert Graves's books. So this was really something that I loved. But when I was going to high school, and you may know that in Poland, or in Gdansk, in the voivodeship of Gdansk, there was one school where you had to take an entrance exam in English, even to get in. Back in those days, it was located in Gdynia. So I was being prepared to take that exam, and when I got there, when you could only choose either a general form or with the preponderance of maths and physics. And my older brother, when I asked him which one I should choose, he said, "Oh, choose the maths and physics, because everyone can teach themselves literature or history. But maths and physics, you really need proper training." So I spent the next 4 years in a heavily, maths and physics class, but it didn't terribly interest me. And I was very fortunate that in the year when I was taking the Matura, they lifted the obligation to take maths. So I was able to do English, history, and Polish. At the end of your high school or gymnasium in those days, you had to take what you might call a baccalaureate, or in English terms, A-levels. And thankfully for me, they lifted the requirement to take math. So I was able just to do humanities subject. And I was, in those days, again, I can't comment on what it's like in Poland now. I can say that my education in general was much better than say, the education of a lot of the British students that I teach, if only because we had to read an enormous amount of poems, novels, all kinds of stories, both for English and for Polish. And when Polish literature was taught, it wasn't just narrowly Polish. We were actually starting the course with Sophocles' Antigone. You then did it chronologically. So before we got to, say, the Polish hymn Bogu Rodzica, we would read Chanson de Roland, of course, in Polish translation. We also studied Shakespeare. Each time before we moved on to, say, Polish Romanticism, you would also read some Byron and some Shelley, so as to contextualize the Polish development. Whereas I'm sorry to say, my own students don't have that context, either the classical legacy or contemporary European context. So I was not, it didn't seem as if I would be studying history, but after my father died when I was 16, first of all, within days of his death, I discovered that he was Jewish. It was something that had been kept from me. I didn't know he was Jewish. I just knew he
So
was Russian.
not at all, like not mentioned
No,
at all.
no, it was completely concealed from me. I knew I knew he had been born in Russia. I also knew, which was very weird, that in his passport it said that he was born in a place called Volkovysk on the 28th of November, but in reality he always said he had been born in Rostov on the River Don on the 1st of December. And so, and I could never, I was too young to understand it and to ask. And I also knew that he had been to the war, and I had assumed he will have been fighting, because I knew he had spent the Second World War in the Soviet Union, but I always assumed that he fought in the Polish sort of army created in the Soviet Union under Soviet auspices. It's only last year that I actually learned that he was forcibly impressed into the Red Army. So, I didn't know. He died within days. I registered for an evening course in French as a kind of tribute to him, because he had wanted to teach me French and I declined. And I was very sad that I didn't follow through with that. Forgive me for waxing so nostalgic, but there's one memory that I really wanted to share with you. And in Poland of those years, where I'm talking in the 70s, there were these clubs, they were called, which were clubs of the press, newspapers, and the book. Klub Prasy i Książki. And as well as buying newspapers, you could go there, have a cup of very good coffee, and there were foreign papers on these big wooden sticks, which were hanging, and you could pick one up. And what I loved most about summer, especially summer evenings, after having been to the beach with my father, and we would go back, and you had dinner at home, which would be about 4 o'clock, and I would be then dressed to the nines in a dress that was sent to me by our family from London, which, that's why I was learning English, to visit Uncle Jenga in London. I had no idea they were, of Jewish background either. And my father and I would go down the promenade in Sopot, and we'd go to that club. And I would sit quietly and watch my father drink a cup of coffee and read Le Monde, the French daily newspaper, taking it off the hook and having it on this big wooden pole. So through my high school, I was just very interested in literature and in languages. And I became very fluent in French through those evening courses. Then I was earning some money teaching English to children, because there was very little money after my father had died. And I was also paying for private lessons for myself of French afterwards. And my dream was to become a translator and interpreter. I really wanted to study what was known as applied linguistics in Warsaw. That was the only place in the country which had that kind of degree course. And it sounds very boring, applied linguistics, but what it meant in practice was that you could become trained as a translator, let's say translator of literature or something else, and also as an interpreter. So, maybe you could work for the UN or an agency of this kind. And I wanted to do it with English and with French. And I also wanted to get away from home because my mother was both verbally and physically abusive, terribly abusive. So I just wanted to get out. And because I had taken part in various what were known as Olympiads, competitions in English and in Polish, and I did very well in them. I had normally in those days in Poland, you had to take an entrance exam to university. But because I did so well in those competitions, I had free entry into any language course anywhere in the country. I could have studied Polish philology, English philology, Iberian philology, Scandinavian languages, anywhere I wanted. But for applied linguistics in Warsaw, I would have had to take the entrance exam in French, not in English, not in Polish. And I prepared all my papers to study there, and my mother basically badgered me into staying in Gdansk. It wasn't very pretty. Her argument was that I would end up in the gutter if I left home. And also that there was no money. Anyway, cut a long story short, it was quite devastating because it was my dream. I remember where the gate to the University of Warsaw was, and I changed the papers and decided to stay in Gdansk and simply study English. And bizarrely, this turned out to have been the best outcome for me. It didn't seem so immediately at the time, but it was brilliant because in those days, the University of Gdansk in general, and especially the English department, were absolutely fantastic. I loved all my tutors, the way they were teaching us, challenging us to think. And when I now look at the Polish academic world, there's so much. I mean, I'm not saying that it had been ideal in the past, but maybe because I began my education in 1983 in the English department. That was shortly after martial law. One of the tutors would only subsequently come back from having been interned. There was a kind of sense of camaraderie and unity and support, and some of our tutors, it's probably unthinkable in Poland in 2024, but some of our tutors even allowed us to call them by their first names. And a few of us would often go and visit them at home. We'd just turn up, because of course nobody had a telephone back then. There was this culture of just popping in. And, this young couple of lecturers, Mirka and Staszek, and 2, 3, 4 of us would rock up in their home in the evening, and we'd sit down and talk for hours. And I have this vivid memory of the end of the first semester. So it's December 1983. And the library was about to close. The whole place was about to lock up for the Christmas break. And I was sitting there in the corridor and crying because I would have to spend the next however many weeks with my mother with no access to the books, to my friends, to the lectures, to the tutors. So that was quite devastating. So I think I got really an excellent education back there. We had compulsory courses, not just on English literature, but American literature, American history and English history, linguistics, historical grammar. So it was a tough degree. After the first year, out of 55 of us, only I think 7 people were in the clear. Everybody else had to redo one or more exams at the end of the summer. But I have the best memories from my time in Gdansk, as I do indeed from my high school, because again, some of my closest friends in Poland date to my time in high school in Gdynia, the one with expanded English. I mean, we still see each other all these years afterwards. So very, very strong friendships there. And again, very intelligent people.
It's interesting what you're saying about high school and about maybe what your father was reading to you and your fascination with historical novels. Because if I look at myself, and I think, about 15 years younger than you are, this thing about Dumas and all those French books, that's still there. At least in my childhood in the 1980s, it was still Dumas, and I was still reading Dumas, and I was fascinated by him. And I remember a very funny moment when I was choosing my master supervisor and master topic. I chose Miriam Yardeni, who was teaching at the University of Haifa. She was already retired, but she would still take students, occasional master students. And she told in one of my classes that she was teaching that it is thanks to this Jewish immigration from Soviet Union that the historical discipline in Israel was upholding because we came with this background and reading Dumas and other historical novels. So I think that's where the dots connect. And yeah, it's interesting that in many other cultures, European cultures, people don't read as much of those historical novels as we did.
But it's interesting because I was talking to an American friend, not Jewish, American friend, around my age, and also a Chinese American woman, very different backgrounds, but we all read Dumas when we were growing up. So, and the funny thing is with Dumas that my father couldn't get hold of a copy of 20 years later by Dumas in Polish. And so I actually struggled through it in Russian just to read it. I couldn't read Russian now, but of course we had it in school and it was taught in a very bad way. I think it was a really lost opportunity because we were taught stupid stuff about um, how you operate a tractor or whatever, instead of reading more poetry and Russian literature. But the only the only way in which I used Russian to read literature wasn't actually to read Russian literature, but Alexander Dumas. So, and we had plenty of Russian books on the shelves. Not many French ones, but when I say Russian, I mean in Russian. And of course, my mother threw them out after my father died. But overall, we had tons of books in the home. And sometimes the way when they were lined up on the shelf, I would end up reading, say, I mentioned Heinrich Mann, a book about Henry IV, and next to it was The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. So I pick it up. And I'm too young to understand what's going on there. So I'm trying to leave through all these boring discussions between Settembrini and Naftov to get to the narrative, and it's not coming. And then next to it, there's Madame Bovary, which I read without quite grasping fully what's going on. So that was quite a lot of fun.
I remember that one of the most impacting books on me was Mary Stuart by Stefan Zweig, which I also read in Russian, and I remember how horrified I was reaching the end of the book and finding out poor Mary being decapitated in a very cruel way. And it was something that I kept in my mind for many, many years to come, that story, to avoid it. You mentioned your father, that he was an immigrant from or a refugee from Soviet Union. And you mentioned that he was not working in some particularly intellectual work, probably because of the circumstances of his life, but you never mentioned what your mother did.
It's a bit complicated with my father because at first he and his family were refugees from Russia, not from the Soviet Union. They escaped from Russia in the early 20s. My father was born in 1907, so we're talking way, way, way back. So they escaped from Russia. His mother was dead by then. She died when he was very young. They escaped to Łódź.
Łódź,
They lived in Łódź, yes.
where I am now, yes.
Exactly. And during the Second World War, some of them perished, some of them managed to escape. One of his brothers, who had been stationed in Prague, managed to get to London, to England. And my father and one of his brothers ended up back in the Soviet Union. They simply, you may remember that there was or you may know there was a call for all the able-bodied men to move east in 39. That would be a kind of line of resistance. And of course, there was no resistance. The Germans overpowered Poland. And at that point, my father and his younger brother simply managed to get through to the Soviet Union. I don't know very much because we never talked about it. It was too late to ask by the time I grew up. But I do know that he was in some camp in Kazakhstan. I know he was in Tashkent, from where he had the degree. It's all a bit, and that he and that brother of his, they didn't spend the war together, but they both found each other and one other brother in Poland after the Second World War. What I only discovered, not even discovered, what I learned last spring through a series of coincidences, not because I was looking for it. Someone got in touch with me from the municipality of Łódź, and through email with that person, I learned that my father's first wife, I knew he had been married before the war, but I didn't know anything about it, except I think I was told that they divorced. Well, it turned out they never got divorced. She and her whole family perished in Auschwitz. So it's only afterwards that I went to Łódź for the first time in my life last autumn. And the first night I got there, I saw the house where my father and his family lived on Piotrkowska Street, number 81. I had no idea. And it was very poignant because I have pictures now. I now realize they were pictures of my father and his first wife. And now I know exactly when she and her brothers and other people, the official from Łódź sent me their death certificates in Polish, but based on the records at Auschwitz. And they all died within just a few months before Auschwitz was liberated. I have the death certificates of my father's first wife and her two brothers and some other family members. And I can see that they all died in the autumn of 44. So, September, November 44. Very shortly before the liberation of Auschwitz. So when my father returned from the Soviet Union and went to Łódź, essentially he discovered that his whole life, family life, was gone. Everybody had been dead. And of course, this began to explain to me why he cried through the night. He had nightmares. So my parents always had to sleep separately. And if we went on holiday and, communist Polish holidays meant that you all were in one room and you couldn't get that much sleep because my father would have these nightmares. And I never, you grow up and you just think, okay, you have a much older father. Your half-brother has a different surname. It's all normal. That's the standard. You don't question it. And I never wondered why that was the case. So now it's all, all these years later, it's all beginning to fall into place. But as I mentioned, I mean, going back to my education and interests, I decided to stay in Gdansk and to study literature, and I really enjoyed that. And there came a point where you had to decide what your master's thesis would be on, because in those days there wasn't a BA degree, there was only an MA degree. So you had to do 5 years and write a master's dissertation. So the time is approaching to write your master's, and I was very interested in working either on romanticism, romantic drama, or on medieval literature, or maybe on Beckett, but there wasn't anyone fit to supervise me. People had other, people were experts in other areas, really. And it just so happened that an Americanist approached me and asked if I would like to work with him. I never thought of studying American literature for my master's, but I really liked him. He was a great tutor. So I said, yes, I'll do it. And I spent a whole year not writing my master's thesis because we agreed that I would work on early American autobiography, William Penn, Benjamin Franklin, and I found that stuff insanely boring. I just couldn't get my teeth into it. And at the same time, I went through a rather bad breakup with someone in my year. So the two things coincided. And as I say, I spent a year not writing my master's thesis and spending most of my time doing a very intensive course of Spanish after hours. It was an optional course. So by the end, there were about 50 people who started that course. It was 3 times a week, 90 minutes. And within 2 weeks, I was the only person left. So for the rest of the year, I had, free private tuition in Spanish, which was wonderful, but didn't do wonders for my MA thesis. And obviously in the department, which was quite small, word was around. Obviously the tutors talked about the students, and I had a reputation as being a very good student. So towards the end of the year, the deputy head of the English department asked me to come for a chat, and he effectively asked if I would be interested in becoming an academic and getting an academic job, which was quite a I always knew I wanted to do something with my life, but I was sort of maybe hoping to teach English at the university, but teaching English as a foreign language, say to students of foreign trade or economics. It never crossed my mind that I could be an academic studying English and teaching it. So, and he said to me, if you are interested, we'll advertise the job and you'll get it. And you start teaching almost immediately before you finish your master's, but you would have to finish your master's in shorter time. So not spend a whole year writing it, but just one semester. And then we'd arrange for you to go to England, to King's College London. The British Council would fund you for one semester to see how they teach English. So it all sounded wonderful, and I agreed, of course, immediately, and I put in my application. But of course, we had to sort out the problem of my master's thesis. So I chatted to my supervisor, and he said, well, if you're not interested in early American autobiography, how about looking at Black American women writers? He was himself working on Black American theater, modern theater. And we're talking late 80s Poland. We're not talking anywhere else. And he gave me a copy of Alice Walker's The Color Purple to read. And I read it and I thought, yes, I'll write about this. And everything happened very quickly. I spent the summer, I should have said I was spending summers working as a farmhand or a barmaid or work in a freezer factory at various student camps in England because I needed to earn money. Now, I suppose it's different, but in those days, very few of my fellow students were doing that because their parents, they were not wealthy, but they had enough money not to be doing that. And of course, going to England every summer when I was a student had the added advantage of being away from my horrible, abusive mother. So I would always buy a 3-month lot ticket to leave the day after the last exam at university. We had exams every year, and to come back the day before the start of the academic year. So I remember I was working in this rather seedy pub called the Elgin in Ledbroke Grove, which is now very fancy in London, but then was a really seedy area. And that's how I was making money to buy books about Black American women writers, so I could write up my master's thesis. And that's how I learned. You can imagine, we're talking 87. That's how I read Germaine Greer, Betty Friedan. That's how I learned about white feminism. And then I was reading about Black feminism, Black feminist authors. One of the authors I studied for my master's was Toni Morrison. And that's before Toni Morrison was well known. That's before she wrote Beloved or before she got the Nobel Prize. So I got my master's January 88. Having taught through the autumn already. And then I went off to London, to King's London for one semester in order to see how they teach English. And
How did that
also,
happen? It's not easy now, but for sure it was not easy back then either to find that kind of possibility to stay for 1 month in well, any British university and just
no,
do
it
that
wasn't 1 month, it was a whole semester.
the whole semester. Yeah.
It was a whole semester, but in fact, I know that you will find it surprising, but it was easier then than it would be now. Because everything was so small. There were a lot fewer people who had any kind of contacts. And my department, especially 1 or 2 people in the department in Gdansk, had contacts in the British Council. We had British Council lecturers. My deputy head of department had a friend at King's. So it was actually much easier for them to arrange it. It was simply said, the man at King's managed to persuade King's not to ask for any fees for me to be around. And the British Council gave a very small grant to me to be there. So it wasn't a big grant. I was very frugal the way I was using it, but it was just arranged without any sort of official application. It was who knew whom. On the whole, my department back then, I only worked there since autumn 87 till spring 91. And then later in 91, I came to Oxford. But during that period, I had this time in London. I had a visiting fellowship at the Kennedy Institute in what was still West Berlin. In fact, October 89, just before the wall fell. I was on an exchange at the University of Newcastle. So I was a very well-traveled person. Of course, you had to go through the rigmarole of applying for a passport each time you wanted to go abroad. And at one point, it was actually, I think, when I came back in 88 from England, that I was asked to go to the headquarters of Gdansk police because the letter said there was some irregularity with my passport. Which was weird because I applied for the passport from the police state to the police station in Sopot where I live, and that's where I surrendered it immediately when I got back. So there couldn't have been any irregularity. But anyway, I said to my master's supervisor, who I was very fond of, I said, I was called to the police station in Gdansk, and he laughed and said, "Oh, they will want to recruit you." He said, he and his wife lived in Gdansk. He said, "Come to us for dinner after your interview." And that also shows, we were very good friends. We were on first name basis. There isn't that, I don't think very many master's students are on first name basis today with their supervisors in Poland. So
Not
anyway,
in Poland.
exactly. Whereas he and his wife were just, I don't know how many times I was there at dinner and we socialized. Anyway, so I went to the police station. We were talking autumn, maybe September, October 88. And that these two guys who literally were trying to recruit me. They asked me what my colleagues in the department think about politics. They implied they knew that my French teacher, and I kept, I still continued with my private lessons. They knew she was an underground solidarity activist. They knew that my uncle, the one who, the younger brother of my father, who had spent the war in the Soviet Union, but after the war went to Paris and became a French journalist. He worked for L'Express and then Le Nouvel Observateur. So they were trying to imply that I was some kind of go-between for my underground solidarity activist of a French teacher and my uncle who writes anti-communist things in France. And I just played completely dumb and said that all I'm interested in is Black American women writers and I can talk to them about that. But I don't know anything about politics. They let me go, but implied that I wouldn't get a passport to go abroad again unless I cooperated. And one of them said that he will get in touch and we should meet for a glass of cognac. And afterwards, he kept ringing my house, but my mother was saying that I was not at home, so I never actually met him. And then by 89, communism fell. But it's quite a weird experience. And there is a sequel to it, which doesn't concern me, but my supervisor. Years later, my supervisor, who became the head of the whole of University of Gdansk, was accused of having been a secret agent. And his reputation was really ruined. And it took years for him to clear his name. Now, of course, when he went abroad, he always had to report to the police. And the fact that it was on the books that he would be interviewed by the police, that was used by all those idiots who tried to to find spies everywhere, a sort of Polish version of a Stasi agent. They argued that he must have been a spy. Now, I was only interviewed once. I had no recollection if I was asked to sign anything when I arrived or when I left. I mean, I know I wasn't asked to sign any cooperation agreement, but maybe when you entered, you had to. I just have no memory. Maybe it says somewhere that I am a communist spy, right? So, and in the end, he managed to clear his name and then I think died of a heart attack very shortly afterwards. So you can see what kind of fallout there could be from even those very late communist years. But another funny thing, and that we're getting back to my career now, is that during my year in England, in London, I wasn't, as I mentioned, it wasn't a research trip. It was a trip whereby I attended tutorials and it was the first time I saw what a tutorial is. At King's, they then still had tutorials where there would be 2 or 3 students in tutorial with a professor. And I attended classes and lectures. The idea was that I would attend them on topics which I would later teach back home. And in the meantime, in the evenings, I was revising my master's thesis for publication. It was published shortly afterwards in Poland, but it was in English. It was called, I think, Three Afro-American Women's Novels, Literary Patterns. It was about, as I mentioned, Toni Morrison, Tozake Shange, and Alice Walker. And in those days, the King's cafeteria was not very savory. So I attended every class and every lecture, even on topics which I knew I would never teach back home, just to fill the time and not sit in some horrible, smelly cafe. And one of the courses was on restoration drama. I didn't know really much about it. We were told about it in Poland, but we never read a restoration play. And I thought, okay, I'll attend this course and I'll see what's what. And I found it incredibly interesting. I loved the plays, the comedies, very, very saucy sex comedies of the later 17th century. And in the meantime, there was a season of restoration plays in Stratford at the Royal Shakespeare Company. And then I ended up going to see those plays. There were 3 comedies and a play by Edward Bond, the modern British dramatist, called Restoration. And I just fell in love with this stuff. And I decided I'm going to ditch Black American women writers, and I will write my doctorate on late 17th century English drama.
And
it
that's
was
how
quite
your historical interest connected with your literary interest, in fact.
exactly. But this was really in some ways purely literary. But that's how I ended up moving from the late 20th century to the late 17th. And I should also say that kings in those days didn't have anybody who worked, not among the lecturers. There was nobody who worked on Black American women writers. So there was this eerie situation. It was a bit surreal that I arrived from Poland and I'm telling the Brits about Black American feminism. And I am something of a radical, if you will. And then I abandoned this in order to move into one of the less well-studied periods in genres, certainly in English literary history. And it was difficult because I understood that I would have to start from scratch, that I have already sort of established a reputation for myself as someone who knows about the later 20th century, especially American literature. I was publishing on the subject, and now I had to begin anew. And of course, I'd spent all this very hard earned money on books by and about Black American women writers. What I did before going back to Poland was to spend virtually all of my savings on more books about and by Black American women writers, just in case I wanted to continue working on it. I went to the Silver Moon bookshop on Charing Cross Road, where all those books were being sold. And then I just put them on the shelf and plunged into restoration drama.
And you never came back.
And I never came back. Never came back. No. Although I had to teach American literature in Gdansk. That's, I was teaching English and I was teaching American literature, critical theory, and of course, just also English conversation. And I was trying to figure out what my doctorate would be on. Naturally, I had a different supervisor for that, although he wasn't terribly interested in discussing he was not as supportive as my master's supervisor in American literature. So whatever progress I was sort of slowly making was done in spite of rather than thanks to him. But where I am grateful to him was that he compelled me to apply for a visiting fellowship in Oxford. It was one of the Soros visiting scholarships, which George Soros created for people from Central and Eastern Europe, also from the Soviet Union. And there would be about 14 of those per year for the whole of Poland. And you could only apply within 3 years of getting your master's. So if I got my master's in 88, I could only, my last opportunity was 91. And my boss told me to apply the second time round, I think, or the third, or the first, and I didn't. And then in the last round, like when I could apply, it was like an administrative order that I had to apply for a visiting fellowship to Oxford or else. And the reason I wasn't keen to apply was because that was a genuine competition, and I just didn't think I stood a chance. And I didn't think that when you compete against people in other subjects, medicine, economics, biochemistry, physics, I just didn't think that they would take someone who wants to work on restoration comedy. I just thought it was a bit improbable that they would want to fund that, because the whole idea of the scheme was that you spend a year or 9 months in Oxford or Cambridge, and that you go back and use your experience and knowledge in Poland. So obviously I assumed that it was much more important to train Polish physicists or doctors than literary scholars. But I was wrong, because I was awarded the scholarship, and I turned up in Oxford on the 1st of October 1991. And I started, this is much more so than in London at King's a few years earlier. This was just a totally different experience, partly because you were in the college community, and partly because my English supervisor, who was the then professor of the then Merton Professor of English Literature, John Carey. So, he was the most esteemed scholar of English literature in Oxford. And someone of that stature was not just incredibly friendly, polite, sportive, but he was also seeing me regularly, whereas I never had a proper supervision with my quote-unquote supervisor back in Gdansk. I think he once asked me, he said we could talk if I drove him in my little Fiat for a haircut in the Gdynia hotel, and then drove him back, right? And we could also talk when he was having his haircut. Whereas here, I was invited to Merton, we sat, we talked, he encouraged me to read. I sat in the Bodleian Library, I was reading books, I was going to seminars where I heard people, graduate seminars, none of which were there at King's. And I was hearing both literary and historical scholars. One of the first seminars I went to was called Literature and History in Early Modern England. And it was run jointly by a historian, Blair Worden, and a literary scholar, David Norbrook. I still remember that seminar. I remember the paper given there was about Milton's Paradise Lost and the political significance of that poem. And it was the seminar itself was held at 8:30 in the evening. So the idea was that it was after dinner for everybody. So and it was held in the flat of one of the organizers. So we would sit there would be the paper, then there would be a lot of wine. There would be a 15-minute break and you got your glass of wine. And then there was a long question and answer session. And there was another series of seminars, which was called Restoration to Reform, which covered basically the later 17th and the whole of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century. And there again, you had historians and literary scholars of that period, and there was a glass of sherry afterwards. And I remember also the first paper in the latter seminar given by Mark Goldie from Cambridge. He had virtually no notes, and he spoke in these beautiful, rounded sentences. He's a great specialist in early modern political thought, especially John Locke and Hobbes. And I have to say, I can still hardly believe it. But Mark Goldie is now a close friend and the referee, and the convener of the seminar, of the conveners of the other one, literature and history. One is a very close friend, the other became my colleague. So it's, little did I know, suspect, or dream that might ever come true.
So then the question is, how did it? How did the girl from Gdansk, even though she went all those lovely seminars, but you come and go, how did you manage to get into Oxford for a job?
Well, it took a while, let's put it this way, because I arrived in 91 and I didn't get my job till 2003. So it didn't happen overnight. But as I mentioned, Oxford really is a democratic place. You could talk to people, you met people. Naturally, I was incredibly insecure as a non-native speaker, learning about early modern literature. On the other hand, people who thought, people I met, I went to a whole lot of classes. My supervisor suggested I attended some master's classes, and I would speak out. I wasn't, on the one hand, I was insecure. On the other hand, I was overcoming my insecurity by asking questions, by reading everything and speaking up. And something that, it keeps coming back. I so loved being away from home and from my mother and from all of that. I was by then in my 20s, but she could be so awful even then. She could even, hit me on the street when I was in my 20s or in front of my private students. And I thought I need to do everything in my power not to go back yet, to do a doctorate maybe abroad. I wasn't even dreaming of doing a doctorate in Oxford. You have to understand that was before email. So I would go to the university offices and I would borrow this big printed book which explained about different kinds of scholarships and who was eligible for what. So I remember I applied for a studentship in Belfast, and I applied for a studentship at Emory University in America. Everything that seemed like it would be possible. But what really helped me was, you see, people in Oxford are extremely friendly, and by that I don't just mean professors, I mean staff, porters, college servants. And when I got to Jesus, the then porter, Mike, said, you're from Poland, you must meet Basia. And he put me in touch with a Polish woman who had been a Soros scholar the year before me, and who at that point was going to do a doctorate in America. And she explained to me how you can apply for doctoral studentships, and that you need to have a certificate, in English, a notarized certificate from the University of Gdansk. So I quickly procured it. So I was prepared, as it were, to apply for things. And another fortunate thing was that Jesus College, where I was sent, I didn't have a choice which college I would be affiliated with. Jesus College, through the initiative of a British Jewish fellow in physics who was very much involved with the Soros scheme, he persuaded them to create a doctoral studentship that would be renewed every year for one of the Soros scholars in Oxford of that particular year. So when I was a visiting scholar at Jesus, there was a Russian guy, Misha, who had been a Soros scholar before me, and now he got one of those studentships at Jesus. And in the end, that's the studentship that I got. So I stayed in the same college where I appeared, and Jesus did that for a number of years. So that was immensely fortunate. And at that point, I obtained unpaid leave from the University of Gdansk for 3 years, which meant that I was able to go back. The idea was I would go back to teach at the University of Gdansk with my doctorate from Oxford. And that's what I was assuming was going to happen. I certainly didn't expect that I would get a job in Britain. I think what changed my outlook, and I was very fortunate in that again, was that when I was applying for a doctorate and when I was accepted, my supervisor decided that he wasn't really qualified to supervise me for a doctorate, the Merton professor, because he really was a specialist in Milton, in poetry, not so much in the drama. And there wasn't really anyone who was much better qualified, but there was an American woman who had once published one book which had one chapter on one restoration comedy. That was the closest you could get. And she wasn't a permanent member of staff. She was a research fellow, senior research fellow. But anyway, I was given over to her. And when I first met her, she invited me to dinner in her college. I mean, this is how you meet your supervisor. So she and her husband invited me to Lineker College for dinner. And I meet this extraordinary woman, very beautifully dressed, made up, long red nails. This wasn't the standard of academics either in Poland or in Oxford in those days, in a Chanel suit. And she greets me and gives me a copy of her review of the sequel to Gone with the Wind, because she's now working on popular culture. And her new book is Classics and Trash, from King Lear to King Kong. And my heart sank. I looked at her and I thought, oh my God, who is this crazy woman? How am I ever going to? It turned out it was the best thing that could have happened. When we had a proper supervision and sat down, Harriet said to me, you're not writing an Oxford DPhil thesis. You're writing an Oxford University Press book. After you get your thesis done, you apply for a junior research fellowship in Oxford. That's how she set out the expectations, the ambition, the horizon of expectations.
That's excellent supervisor. It's really
absolutely excellent. And she was having taught, because she had taught in America. I think she studied at Columbia and then she taught at Vassar College. So she was an eminent academic in America. She published on Shakespeare, and because she married this British guy, she came to Oxford. And of course, there was no question of her getting a permanent job, but she had an association with Oxford. She was a member of the faculty. I was her first and last as a student, as it turned out, but she was professionalized in a way that British supervisors were not. We are now. This has all changed. But back then, doctoral students were often just left to graze by their supervisors, and they read a lot, but they weren't actually writing up. Whereas Harriet, if I wasn't producing a chapter, she would come down on me like a ton of bricks. So, and she may not have known the literature, but she was very happy for me to seek advice and support elsewhere. She wasn't one of these supervisors who are jealous that their student is talking to someone else. On the contrary, she would always say, ask X, ask Y, a visiting scholar, a professor from another university, but just make sure that you're producing and make sure that you're applying for things. And when I started the doctorate, now you have to do a master's, and only then are you admitted to do a doctorate. So it's 1+3. In those days, the MSc was part of doctoral funding, but you still had to do some courses and take what was known as the qualifying exam. And one of the courses was in bibliography. And I was thinking, why am I supposed to be studying bibliography? What does it mean? How to prepare a list of the books that you read? Of course, I had no idea that what it meant was a course in how books are made, how they circulate, basically book history. And my professor for that, Don Mackenzie, was one of the founders of the discipline, especially the study of what is now known as the sociology of text. And he was a New Zealander, an incredibly nice, thoughtful, imaginative man who was extraordinarily helpful. Imagine the first class in bibliography, which was wonderful. He showed us a book which had blank pages, and he asked us to work out what that book was. And we all looked at him and said, how can you know? There's no text. And he coaxed us into figuring it out based on the kind of paper, based on the binding, based on the size of the sheet. So anyway, he asked each of us in that group, we were divided into periods, so I was in the early modern period. He asked each of us to tell him what we were going to be working on. And I said I was going to be doing my doctorate on Restoration drama. And later that day, again, I feel I have to remind you, there's no email. But there's something which we call in Oxford, and it still exists, pigeon post, which means that people on bicycles carry letters from one college to another. So you always checked your pigeonhole. And if I want to write to a colleague in another college, I can leave it in a tray at the Porter's Lodge, and it will be carried the same day. Actually, they do it twice a day. So later that day, I go to my pigeonhole, and I find a handwritten note from Professor Mackenzie saying that he found the topic of my doctorate very interesting, and would I like to come to Pembroke College for lunch to talk about it, because he is working on an edition of William Congreve, who is one of the Restoration dramatists. And Don, as he was known to friends, Don became a great friend and supporter, patron, and someone to whom I owe a lot. In the bibliography course, on which you would be examined, you were able to volunteer to give a presentation. You didn't have to, but I volunteered because that was my way of overcoming my insecurity. I thought, I will be examined on it, so I'll volunteer. I'll commit myself to giving a presentation, and it will then form the basis of my exam essay. And when I gave the presentation, Don said in front of the whole class, he said, there are real jewels here. I just remember that phrase. And he encouraged me after I passed the exam, he encouraged me to send it to a journal. And that essay became the first English language publication in England. It came out in 94. I wrote it in 92. So, sorry, in 93. So within a year of my doing the course. And Harriet, my supervisor, would say, ask Dawn, ask someone else. She was very happy for me to seek help elsewhere. But as I mentioned, if I wasn't producing, she would call me at home in my student apartment, and she would give me such a talking to that. And sure enough, in my third year of a doctorate, she said that I should start applying for junior research fellowships. So I started writing those applications, and the first ones I applied, I got shortlisted for one in Cambridge at Girton College and for one in Oxford at University College. The University College, the interview was first. And again, Harriet gave me invaluable advice before that interview. She said to me, look, they're not looking, you can't look like a student. They're looking for a colleague. And she even told me how to dress. And this will sort of amuse you, because when I was going back to Poland, so this is 94 now, Poland already had ceased being communist. It was opening to the West. And it was exporting a lot of clothes to the West. Because the labor was so cheap, one of the fashion labels it was producing clothes for was Pierre Cardin in France. And in a shop in Sopot, my hometown, you could cheaply buy clothes for Pierre Cardin, which had some little fault, right? So when I was in Poland, I got myself a Pierre Cardin suit and a Pierre Cardin coat. And Harriet said to me, you must wear your Pierre Cardin suit to that interview. High heeled shoes, you were. So it wasn't just what you were going to say, but also how you looked. And these days, 2024, when you apply for a junior research fellowship, I always encourage my students to have published something already as soon as possible when they are master's students or doctoral students. In those days, nobody applying for a JRF will have published anything. And I already had one essay out, and another had been accepted by the Review of English Studies just before the interview. So that was another advantage. And the final advantage, because you see, I keep telling you about wonderful people who were very helpful. And they were just helpful because they were interested in my work, but also in the case of Don, I wasn't completely unique. He was, there is a whole generation of us who will sing the praises and eulogize Don Mackenzie because of how generous and how wonderful he was. And I know for a fact that he was advising someone else applying for junior research fellowships on how that guy should dress. So that also was, that was part of a convention. Anyway, Don introduced me to someone who was an independent scholar, not an academic, but who was extremely well published and who was giving a lectures in Oxford in 94. He was a visiting fellow at All Souls. His name was William Sinclair. And the reason Don introduced me to him was because William was giving a course of lectures on publishing and canon formation in the period. And because by then my own work, I ceased working on restoration comedy, and my doctorate developed into a study of appropriation and plagiarism in late 17th century drama. So I met William, and William offered to give me a mock interview. I've never heard of the concept of a mock interview. And so when I was shortlisted for the Junior Research Fellowship, I cycled to All Souls for my mock interview, and William took it very seriously. He dressed in the university gown and pretended that he was letting me into the room. And he asked me to give my presentation. They said I should talk for 5 minutes about research. And I started talking. And William was a Scot and a very direct, blunt man. And he immediately interrupted me and said, "No, no, no, this is all wrong. You're speaking for too long. You shouldn't be reading from a piece of paper. You can, in a 5-minute presentation, you can only make 3 points." I got very upset. I literally started crying because I thought, oh God, this is awful. So I cycled back. I practiced in front of the mirror. The next day I came back for another mock interview. And so when the real interview came, I had been prepared. I felt much better than I would have if I hadn't had the advice either about the dress or about how you give a presentation. I practiced in front of a mirror. There was a mirror in my student digs in the side of the wardrobe. So I was sitting on the brown carpet, looking at the mirror and speaking to it and looking at myself in the mirror the way I was going to look at the audience. So although, of course, you don't know if you got something, but I knew that the interview went quite well. So I crossed the street. I went back to William's room in All Souls. We opened a bottle of wine, drank a lot of it, got into William's car, drove to a Chinese takeaway, got the takeaway, went to my student digs, and my fellow students and William and I were sitting there and eating the Chinese takeaway, and I was really pretty tipsy, and the phone rang. I answered, and it was the master of University College saying he was offering me the Junior Research Fellowship. So you hear, when you're successful, and it's still the case now, the successful candidate almost always hears on the same day, whether it's a Junior Research Fellowship or a proper job. So at that point, obviously, I was absolutely elated, but I also realized that I needed to give up my job in Gdansk because nobody would keep it open for me and keep a junior, an unpaid position, give me more unpaid leave.
Wow, what a story. And after you accomplish that fellowship, I assume that the fellowship takes 2 or 3 years, right? This junior fellowship.
The fellowship is for 3 years.
3 years.
But you must remember that in those days, Poland was not part of the EU. So it wasn't, it was quite stressful waiting for the work permit to take up that position. And it wasn't, you could only apply just before taking it up. I got the fellowship in 94, but I wasn't taking it up till 95. So when I got it, I was advised that I should try to apply for a proper job as soon as possible. And in fact, in the second year of my fellowship, I got a permanent job at the University of Wales in Aberystwyth. So I gave up a year of my fellowship in order to take up a proper job and to be assured at that point that I would be staying in the UK. So in 97, I moved to Wales. My heart bleeds, especially for UNIV, which was a wonderful college and a fantastic community. And I made friends there. Last week, when I was giving a talk in Cambridge, I was seeing a friend whom I met. She was the English tutor back then in UNIV. So I went to Aberystwyth, having got my Viva and having got my thesis book accepted by Oxford University Press, as my doctoral supervisor had predicted. Sadly, she hadn't lived to see it happen. She died. So I went to Aberystwyth, which was very far away, and trains were very bad. But the area was very beautiful. It's on the sea, and I joined the hiking club. But I always wanted to come back to Oxford or to move to Cambridge. I didn't want to make any side moves, to move from Aberystwyth to Liverpool, Manchester, or somewhere else. I really I really wanted to be back in a context where you are in a college community. And I think in 99, I had a visiting fellowship in Cambridge from Aberystwyth. I liked it, perhaps not as much as Oxford, but so my aim always was to come back. And I tried several times. And in 2003, to my utter amazement and delight, I actually got a job at Jesus, which was my old graduate college. And I've been here ever since. So from the 1st of October 2003. So I've now been here for 21 years. And I have to say that Jesus has become an even more wonderful college than it was then. And I can really say that this is my dream job. But something that's happened, and I know we don't have time to talk more about it, but my work for a long time was, even though it was obviously informed by the understanding of the historical context and period, it was very much based on the study of literature or criticism. As I mentioned, I was interested in ideas of authorship and plagiarism and literary appropriation. And then I thought I would like to change the focus of my work and perhaps write a book about the history play, how historical drama developed in England. And I spent one sabbatical at the Folger Shakespeare Library in the States, still a sabbatical from Wales, reading every single history play written in England between the early 16th and the early 18th century. And it became obvious that in order to do it well, I needed to learn a lot more about history. And the more I learned about history, the more I became fascinated by it and started writing not just about historical drama, but about history and history of political thought. And in the process, I started returning not to the books that I read, that were read to me by my father, but to the period that my father introduced me to through the books that we read either of English or of French literature. And it's sort of quite special for me that an essay of mine that is coming out this month is not actually on anything English. It's about representative assemblies in the political thought of Jean Baudin, a late 16th century political philosopher. And the primary texts are his writings in French, especially his 6 livres de la République, the 6 books of the Republic or Commonwealth, and his own Latin revision and expansion of it. So a very different discipline, less history, more history of political thought, and not American or English literature, but 16th century French political thought. And it's a kind of tribute to him 44 years after he had died.
Thank you very much for this fascinating conversation. I think that the context that you gave, the historical context to your life, is not less fascinating than the story itself. So thank you once again. And hopefully we'll have an opportunity to continue this talk on another occasion and maybe also in some public space. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Michael.